study circle. I will pass it to you, Monika, to start.
All right. Let me just, I guess if you can start. Yeah, thanks. Ooh, somehow it's not letting me, optimize. Why isn't it letting me share?
I made you a co-host. Maybe that's
no, it just this is like I have to give permission. Oh, okay. So sorry, I'm gonna relog back. There's like some new stuff here. Okay, so I'll be back in a second.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, it's always kind of annoying how Apple makes you like have to like do this. Let me share my book. All right, so you guys can see my screen. Yeah.
Yes.
So last week, we kind of went over the whole error handling in Combine, which was kind of actually a little gnarly, mainly because, yeah, I mean, to cover all the different errors and deal with like when do you actually retry, you can get, so by the end of it, I think we had some sort of a long, let's see if I can get to where it was. So something like, there was like, that authentication service that we had defined, and here it, is checking for the username being available, but there's all these cases that we check for error. And further down here, actually, this was in, so there's like, it gets more interesting, like when we're like actually looking for, okay, so if like there was some transport error, return that. Then, now if there wasn't a transport error, then you're going to have some data and response. And then in here, you're basically checking if you have a response or not, and then you're throwing an error there. Then if the response code is valid, that's good. Otherwise, then you're sort of decoding the error message. And then that itself, we check for certain status codes and we throw it. So you can kind of see that it's getting sort of longer and longer as we keep going. And then at some point, we also look at parsing errors, because when we're doing the JSON decoding, and this is like, it's not like you haven't seen this before, because even in, non-combined code, we do have to go through all these checks. It's just that when you're looking at publisher and all the cases that you're checking, that code does get quite long, because you're looking at all these different cases and throwing the appropriate error. And even at some point, he introduces like, how about if you wanted to like deal with retries, because for certain types of errors, you want to actually go and retry. So the way we were doing it is like delay for a while and return that publisher again. And then basically you're resubscribed to this new publisher, and then go through the whole entire, like getting to the, trying to make the network call. So then in chapter 11, he's talking about like, okay, like let's go back to why we were using Combine and what are the different aspects. So there's the publisher, which delivers values over time. There's subscribers that are acting on these values as they receive them, and the operator, which is sitting in the middle between the publishers and subscribers and can be used to manipulate the stream. And he was saying that, operators are very powerful because a lot of times, they can kind of massage the events that we're getting and either map it to a different type of events or reduce like how often we're kind of propagating these events with that debounce that we saw when we were like doing the search field and typing in the search field, and like removing duplicates. Flat map is like creating a new publisher. And he was saying like, with that long sort of like code for the publisher, we could create these custom operators, and custom operators are almost like, having a, and he goes through like, how do you actually create a custom operator? Because the nice thing about custom operator that you write this code once, and after that, you're just calling the operator. You don't go through that whole long code everywhere where you're doing like, for instance, these error handlings. You kind of want to do it once and then use that operator anywhere with any sort of network call that you're making. And basically, he gives like a very simple example where we're extending publisher, so you're writing your publisher, you can create an extension publisher and add a method that basically sort of is acting like your operator, where, it gets called on the publisher, and then it does something with the events that it's getting, and then it's returning another publisher. And an example he gives is like this dump function, where like the Swift dump kind of gives you that whole like, I don't know how many of you guys have used Swift dump. I actually haven't used it that much. But whatever the value is, the dump kind of shows the whole, it's kind of like the debug description when we were using it for views for UIKit. So it kind of gives the whole tree structure, if whatever that value is, and of course it was just like a string or something, we'll just return that. But the idea is that, with the dump as a method for publisher, you can basically call handle events, which is a method for a publisher. And there's different kind of events that you could be subscribing to, but for dump, we're interested in the output, what's the output event of a publisher. So if we're getting a value from that, then we can call Swift dump on the value. And then basically an example is like, let's say we're just, just is like a one time publisher of some data. So in here we have date, and when we call dump, then there you go. You see what exactly was the, the date when it was passed through the publisher. So from then on, we don't have to constantly go and, do this whole like receive output, whatever. We just call dump. And then whatever is, it acts as an operator for, and it doesn't have to just be, this kind of an operator. I mean, a publisher, it could be any publisher. As long as we call dump on it, we'll get the whatever the, a dump of the the event value that was passed in or coming through. So then he suggests like, okay, so remember, we had this kind of a longish, this try catch thing that we were doing for the data task publisher. And the way he had it before, anytime like, in any of our service calls, when we were like, returning a publisher to do a network call, we would be adding all this to deal with the error handling. And, in that case, like basically we would be like duplicating this, in a bunch of places. But if we now add this code as a method for, as an extension to publisher, then we can define it in one place. And then anytime like we want to do this kind of a retry error for any of our, like, mostly it's relevant for network calls, but we could just do that dot retry and be able to, and then pass any sort of condition potentially that we would need. And then we just be able to use it. And it makes the code a lot cleaner because, we're not kind of duplicating this logic that's kind of gnarly and have it in one place. And if we decide to change anything in it, we'll just have one place to change that. So I'll pause for a second because it's just, there have been a lot of information. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how do folks feel about like, does this whole idea of publisher and subscriber after going through a bunch of these chapters, do these kind of make sense? Should we kind of go over that? How many people kind of looked at the error handling also chapter? Because this chapter 11 is kind of based on, it's providing, it's kind of cleaning up some of the stuff that he discussed there in terms of like, how, yeah, it's a little gnarly, but there's a way like you can sort of encapsulate it in this kind of an operator and use it in other places. But it would be good to know if you guys have any sort of questions. And it's okay to say, well, I haven't really read through some of the chapters, which is fine too. We can kind of go over the previous chapters too. Because the thing is like, he goes through like improving this retry operator and then, at the end, showing how it's called, but it's kind of like, it's sort of an extension of chapter 10, I think the meat, all this is very good. I think chapter 12, like, oh, well, this was so far we were kind of using existing, when Apple kind of moved to Combine, it's sort of, we basically got an extension of some of the existing Apple APIs being able to provide this, publisher concept, like the data task publisher for the URL session, those kind of things. In chapter 12, which we haven't started, that's when you're like, okay, but I have my own APIs or I'm doing other things. How do I incorporate Combine in there? And that is a good sort of a coverage too. But
Monika, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, would you mind explaining the? Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's just go through. It's always and interestingly, we didn't have any exercises for. There was things that he kind of went through, but we didn't kind of go through a lot of exercise there. Let's see. So yeah, let's go from the. So we kind of went back to in chapter 9. We talked about using the networking existing like the Combine extension for doing networking calls. So there was this example that, let's see if I have the one that he had. Yeah, let's see. So we had this authentication service that we wrote, and that's like, anytime you're writing code that sort of making a network call, you're sort of using a service that actually makes the network calls. I'm just trying to show you guys because he added these things there. So optimizing. Okay, I think it was fetching data. Yeah. So he was kind of showing, okay, you have a URL, and usually in, your regular, app code, if, for instance, the URL is not valid, you return an error, so that, and you don't continue on. In the examples he was giving with networking, we were sort of ignoring the error. Like, for instance, in this case, this publisher that's doing the network calls, it's just returning a Booleans, like whether this username is available or not. And it does not give, usually we have this combination of like a result, which is like the actual value, and then a potential error that could be in there. Here, he was kind of just sort of like saying, okay, well, if there is an error, it means false. So the username wasn't available. And he kind of mentioned actually when we had him, then we hadn't started error handling yet. Yeah, I'm sort of skipping a step because I was just trying to show how to make these, network calls through Combine, and here then the network call is getting, there's a URL session, the data and URL session now through Combine has this data task publisher where, you pass a URL and then you get a result that's, the data, and then use the data to get the actual, model type that you have. And anytime, like, if there's an error here, there is for the publisher, there is this replace error, because there's times when you don't want to like deal with errors, and each of the operations could, throw an error. But in these cases, then you're basically saying whatever, and this is kind of what replace error kind of does, like whatever error that got thrown, basically just, replace it with false. And, for some cases that might be okay, because you don't need to show to the user that, there is an issue with the networking. So when we're kind of saying false, this username is not available in this case, that's not really true. It's just that we can't connect to the server. But in most times, for most realistic scenarios, we actually do want to, display it to the user that, hey, there's a networking, maybe you try later or whatever. So then in chapter 10, we started with, okay, we were ignoring errors. In some cases we may ignore the error, which is kind of like how we were doing before. But other times, we would want to also be able to catch the error. And for certain types of errors, we may want to retry, and then, and for a lot of cases, we also want to catch the error and show an appropriate error message to the user. So this is like, but how do we like, actually, how do we actually like get an error, be able to catch it and do the right thing? So that was, showing. So here he was just discussing all these different scenarios where it would make sense to deal with errors. So then we kind of go back to that example again with the username available. And one of the things is that we were basically, here the username, as the user is typing the name, this is a publisher of the username. We kind of were doing the whole debounce thing so that we're not constantly getting every character. So it waits for a little bit until the user, there's a, pause for 0.8 seconds and then sends the current, username characters, and we remove duplicates, all that we discussed, I think in chapter 9. And then here, we get a username and, we're sort of returning this operator that we're calling on it for, checking it to see if it's available or not. And this was kind of a new thing. So just like with, do and catch in when we're actually have a publisher, we can also call catch in case it throws an error. Now this kind of a catch and then just return just false, it seems to me is the same as kind of replace error, where we were just saying, okay, any error that comes, just return false, as the value, don't worry about the error. This is kind of doing the same thing. And the reason he's just saying that the only difference is here, we do get the error. In this case, we've decided to sort of not do anything with it and just return, a publisher that just returns false. But since we have the ability to now get the error, we could use it to do something. So the next step would be, okay, he shows let's have a special result type. And result type is something that's in Swift that we do a lot of times use for network, mostly for network communication, because it kind of allows you, it's kind of like a tuple of information. It's either when it's successful, it will return you the actual value that, the result is associated with. If it's not successful, then it returns you an error. And that's kind of what we want when we're doing this error handling here, that, so we want our publisher, instead of just returning that bool that we saw before, we wanted to actually return this result. And then, we do this, an extension for publisher that, anytime, you're get a success, anytime, I guess interesting, if you get an error, it's easier to look at it that way. If you get an error, just return that error and as a failure, because at the end it's returning this publisher. So just, publish the error, the result that's kind of associated with that error. Otherwise, treat it as a success, and then, you will get the actual result that's associated with that. This is like a type alias that he's kind of defining, but he's showing you how you can use it here. So when we do this as result for this check user name available publisher, then it's basically creating a new publisher that's, returning this result and then there's never, in case you guys are wondering, with the publishers, always like some type of, whatever the resulting type is, and then whether it can fail or not. And in these cases, we still, because we don't want it to just kind of like stop and not, because then if you're like basically have a stream of events, there could be some errors in some of them, but you don't want to just kind of stop and not receive them anymore. You could, for some, you could say it could fail and then it would just stop. But in this case, we say it never fails, but we do have a way of dealing with errors if we got an event and that there was an issue with that. And that makes sense for certain things. I mean, obviously with a networking call, it's like kind of a one-time thing. It's not like except unless you're doing a retry where, it could get new events. But a lot of times if it does get into error, you kind of want it at that point to fail, but still get the information. You don't want it to just fail and not get the information. So that's kind of the distinction, because you still want to get what the error was. So you don't want it to just stop because it failed. And that's why I think we want to always put never here, but be able to handle the error case when it happens, so that we can actually get it and do the right thing. So that was a lot of things that I just said. Any questions till now? Like any confusion, anything? Because it's a lot of like stuff to just throw there. And it may make sense to like read it a couple of times, because I kind of found like the first time that I read it, I was like, okay, it was just a lot of information. And even though, as I mentioned, when you're writing iOS apps, of course you're, and most like majority of the apps do make like network calls. So you're kind of familiar with getting errors and doing things like that. It's just that this particular chapter is discussing how you would do it in this kind of a combined publisher way.
Yeah, I have a question,
Okay.
Monika. So I noticed like the publisher in general has a return type. Like any publisher has a return type of some value and never. That never could be an error.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm wondering like what was the intention behind the author to have a type alias when we could return that error? Again, maybe I'm missing something, but it's something interesting to know, like why have a type alias?
You're saying why never is used, or
Yeah, exactly. Because
yeah.
like we could always return that value of never as an error, right? Instead of
Well, yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, from what I understand is if you say it fails, then if any sort of like error happens, it will just stop. So you won't get an event back, right? It just kind of like halts. While in your case, I mean, at the end, you are kind of halting because, obviously you get an error. You're not going to go to the next step of whatever you're doing. Let's say for that example I showed with the URL, if the URL is not the right format, it doesn't make sense to even do the network call. But you still kind of want to send an event or, send a result that kind of encapsulates that error, so that as the caller, you'll know, okay, such an error happened. I may want to display it. I may want to do other things. You don't want it to if you just say it will fail, you won't get anything back, including the error. It just kind of like, it failed, like, that event doesn't come to you. So I think that's kind of the difference, that most of the time we don't want to, we do like, it'll be interesting. And it's too bad Peter is not here in what cases, and I may like do a little I'll check to see like in what cases do we want to actually say that it does fail, and how do we like, is there a way once you say it fails that you can do something about that failure? I don't know. But I think for these cases, he's kind of saying we don't want to tell Combine that this publisher fails, but it could, as part of whatever, that's why we're kind of doing this resulting that, it as part of whatever operation it's doing, it returns this, either a valid, output or a failure here. So, and the only difference is we will get this event, right? We will get it. But it's either going to be whatever is a successful result and whatever value, true or false, for whether the username is available or not, or a failure where you get that error object or element, and then you can see what the actual error was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and now it makes sense, because if the pipeline itself is not going to execute on a failure,
Yes,
then
exactly.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the pipeline will just not, so you wouldn't want that. You kind of want it to continue. But at the same time, in chapter 9, we just said it's always going to return a Boolean. And if at any point an error is thrown, just replace it with, false. Here we're saying, no, it's, we get a more, a better kind of a result where, yes, if it succeeds, it's going to be a Boolean. So you'll know, whether username is available or not, but you can also get an error. And so, but it is a little bit of like, sure, Grecia, I'm going to be the host for this. Yeah, I mean, I think my view of Combine is that, you could read a lot and, but until you kind of use it in an app and kind of play with it, some of these concepts kind of feel a little foreign because they're different from how we usually, deal with, different aspects of either. I think for SwiftUI, Combine, seems like more like, because everything is based on a change in a state, and the whole idea of publishing and subscribing makes a lot of sense, because things will react to some change. So you want to subscribe for those changes. And if that change is either some, call to the network to validate something or get some new information, or doing something else, like only, you're kind of subscribed to that new information. And when it happens, then everything updates based on that. So, it makes sense that, if you're writing, and people have been with UI Kit, they were using RX Swift and whatever to do Combine. So it's not like, oh, you only do it for Swift UI, but it makes sense. But I still kind of think, we can like read all this stuff, but until like we, even doing a simple, taking like writing a very simple app that's like connecting, like the weather app that everyone likes to do, and writing like a Swift UI, just to show the current weather, and then using Combine to make calls to the weather service, and then seeing how, can we like incorporate this way of like calling the network, getting results. And because I think once you kind of do it, and I haven't done it yet, so I have to be honest about it, that it is on my plan, because I'm like, yeah, I read this, I kind of conceptually understand, but at the same time, till you actually give it a try, it may not kind of sink in a way that you can say, oh, this kind of makes sense. So going back to the error stuff, there were some new operators too that kind of got introduced here. And I do have to say, it would have been nice if, and I might give this feedback to Peter, that, he does kind of throw some new operators like try map, which kind of makes sense. I mean, okay, it's now getting this data response. So if it's successful, then it's gonna like if it gets the data, then it can do the stuff. Otherwise, it's throwing an error that gets. And let's see where this thing is. So try map. So here we're like, yeah, so here we were like, let's see here. Yeah. So going back, we started with the URL, and then if it wasn't successful, we would send that result with this error. So that kind of made sense. And then here, if we're initially calling and it's just making this call, that map error, like if it had some networking like error, like it didn't even get the result back, then that's definitely what we would consider as a transport error. Maybe the network is not available. Basically it's not able to connect. So it, if it ran into an error here, then we would be returning. Now, if it didn't have an error and we actually get a data and a response back, then we're got to this point that we actually have a data. But here, we can then check, okay, we know we had the data and the response, but it's possible that our response is not a URL response or a HTTP URL response. So, throw an error for that case. And then basically, if it's like, then checking the status code, yeah, if it's within range, it was good. Otherwise, oh, there must have been, and this would be the case that you're calling an API that has a certain format for the error. In this case, he has this API error message format. So using a JSON decoder to take the JSON. So you get a JSON back, but there wasn't, a bad status, and you're going to decode that error and then throw the right stuff there. And then in this case, if all this is good, then you got a valid data. And this kind of makes sense, but it would make more sense when you're sort of like looking at okay, so this was kind of defining this check user name available publisher. Here we're actually like calling it, so we're calling this publisher. So then we can see that, when it's mapping, we're looking at the result. And, these would be the different kinds of errors. If it was a failure case, this is kind of the results that errors that, because remember that, when we're calling, like, this is the publisher, I'm subscribing to it, and based on what result I'm getting, I'm doing other things like, this is all the result of all this is, assigned to the username message. So based on if it's error or something, we may want to put a specific username message for the user. In the success thing, then, if it's true or false, we will put a, specific message for that. So this would be as a subscriber to this. Here, it's basically, I believe that when it's doing this try map thing, that, if it throws an error, then remember that as result thing, that type that we created, then that will be converted to an error result that as a subscriber, then we can take a look. And because it would be a failure in that result, and then we can check to see if the error was, what kind of error it was. But yeah, it's definitely a lot to wrap your head, because they're just different. And then he does also mention, you may want to have like specific, like even go more like the kind of like server side errors you're getting. And, there might be some like, specific messages that you may want to return based on those errors that you want to show. So it kind of goes through that. And again, as a subscriber, it kind of shows that, because he had an example that maybe if you're running into a validation error where the JSON is not in the format that you wanted, in his case, he wants to let the user know, oh, maybe you have an older version of the app. Although, yeah, I mean, if you're using a particular version of an API, a set version, that shouldn't really happen. I mean, if it's a proper backend, it wouldn't go and suddenly change the format on the JSON for you unless, it it moved to a different version. Because usually, yeah, you never want to get into this situation if you're, have the right sort of API definitions, because once a version is set, you don't want the server to go and change the response. If they want to do it, they should up the version. But he was just giving an example that, okay, if you get that error, then you can kind of show a little, enable a button to say upgrade. Any questions so far? So I would suggest, if you have time, try, I would say, try to kind of read chapter 9, 10, and 11 again, just to kind of go through, okay, how did that networking kind of work? How does error handling, and don't get too hung up about it, because as I said, you're just capturing a lot of this information. And, when I think the best thing would be, and I'm almost thinking like maybe at the end of this book, we'll write a little project, just to practice some of these things, because I think that's the best way for it to stick. And then, next week, we would like to do chapter 12, because I think that's like, and he shows, and this could be a good example that, he's using, a Firebase API as a study. Yeah, I think a project is really good. And we can check his case study, to see, okay, you were making some existing API call. How do we take all this information that we learn and, put it in there? I haven't read this chapter, so I don't know how clear it is, but I think, it's worth reading this, and maybe even just like read this and kind of refer back to the other chapters, to see, if you're not understanding something he's doing. But I definitely think what we should do is at the end of part 2, just kind of do a simple like weather app just to practice these things. And that's easy to do. And then, similar to the async await, which is a whole different thing. maybe do an example for that too. Anyhow, I do apologize that I did get a little late today, but I hope I see all of you next week. And then we should just, persevere, do this. And again, there's times when a lot of other work comes, it's hard, but just try to read through it. And I'm kind of looking forward to see what his case study is. And again, we'll do the project at the end. Okay. And anyways, I'm going to stop recording.